You need to check the used names list carefully, then write the story. The names to avoid are all in the uploaded file. Let me write with completely new names. My son was supposed to be at a work conference in Las Vegas when I had the stroke. That's what he told me afterward. Conference. Very important. Career-defining. The hospital called his number 31 times over 2 days, and he didn't answer once. I know because I counted every single missed call on that printout the nurse handed me when I finally woke up. 31 calls. And somewhere between call number 4 and call number 31, my son found enough Wi-Fi signal to post a video of himself at a blackjack table with the caption, "Living my best life, baby." I saw it with my own eyes, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. The beginning is where you see how long this was coming. It was a Tuesday morning in late October. The kind of October morning that reminds you why you stayed in Ontario your whole life. Crisp air, the maples outside my kitchen window burning orange and red, that particular quality of morning light that only happens in autumn. I was making tea, chamomile the way I always do. Kettle on, mug out, the small domestic ritual I've had since my husband passed 4 years ago. I remember reaching for the honey. That's the last clear thing I remember. Reaching for the honey and then the floor. They told me later that my neighbor Bette found me. She'd come over to return a casserole dish from the week before, knocked, got no answer, saw my car in the driveway, and used the spare key I'd given her years ago. She's 73 herself, Bette, with bad knees and a heart condition of her own, and she still knelt down on my kitchen floor and held my head until the paramedics came. I think about that often. A 73-year-old woman with bad knees on a cold tile floor, staying calm, staying with me. The paramedics said it was an ischemic stroke. Not the most severe kind, but serious enough. I was unconscious for most of the ambulance ride. When I arrived at St. Joseph's in Hamilton, the emergency team moved fast. I have no memory of any of it. What I know is that while all of that was happening, the ambulance, the emergency department, the first hours of stabilization, the hospital was calling my son. His name is Patrick. He's 41. He works in commercial real estate development in Toronto, which means he spends a great deal of time talking about money and very little time thinking about anything else. He has a wife, Dana, and they have one child, my granddaughter Maisie, who is 9 years old and the single most important person in the world to me. Maisie has her grandfather's eyes, warm and brown and honest. Patrick told me the conference was in Las Vegas. 3 days, he said. Networking, panels, the usual. He'd mentioned it weeks ago, almost as an aside, the way he mentions most things that don't involve him needing something from me. I told him to have a good trip. He didn't offer to check in while he was away. The hospital reached his cell phone, then Dana's cell, then Patrick's cell again, then the hotel where he'd said he was staying, then his cell again, then his cell again, 31 times total, spread across 2 days while I lay in a neurological unit in Hamilton. Somewhere in those 2 days, according to the timestamp on his Instagram, he posted that blackjack video on a Friday evening. He posted a second photo on Saturday afternoon, a poolside shot, sunglasses, a drink in his hand, number Vegas baby. I didn't see any of this until Bette showed me. She'd been sitting with me in the hospital since the first day. She brought her reading glasses and a paperback novel and a Tupperware container of homemade shortbread. When I was well enough to look at a screen without the headache becoming unbearable, she handed me her phone. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were something between angry and sad. I looked at the photos for a long time without saying anything. He had full cell service. He had Wi-Fi. He was posting on social media while my brain was doing whatever it does during a stroke, and a 73-year-old woman with bad knees was the only person on earth who showed up for me. I handed Bette her phone back. I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about 4 years ago. My husband Gareth died in November. He'd been sick for 8 months. A slow, grinding decline that I managed mostly alone because Patrick was in the middle of a major deal for most of those months. Gareth asked for Patrick near the end. Not dramatically, not with urgency, just the way you ask about someone you love and miss. Is Patrick coming this weekend? Has Patrick called? I fielded those questions for weeks, making excuses, saying Patrick was busy, saying he'd be here soon. Patrick came 3 days before Gareth died. He stayed for a weekend. He left Sunday evening because he had an early meeting Monday morning. Gareth died Wednesday. Patrick drove back up for the funeral, stood beside me in the front pew in a beautiful charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, accepted condolences with a steady handshake and a composed face, and left again 2 days later. I told myself he grieved differently. I told myself his way of coping was to keep moving, keep working. I told myself this for 4 years. I told myself a great many things that weren't true. After Gareth died, I tried harder. I called more often. I invited them for dinners, for holidays, for Maisie's school events that Dinya sometimes mentioned in passing. I drove to Toronto for Maisie's piano recital because they couldn't make the trip to Hamilton. I mailed birthday cards with checks inside that Maisie thanked me for by text, which I understood was probably Patrick or Dina's doing, not hers. I tried to stay in her life. That little girl is everything to me. The visits grew shorter each year after Gareth died. The Christmas after his death, Patrick and Dina came for 3 days. The Christmas after that, one day, last Christmas, they had dinner with Danae's family in Oakville and came to me for 2 hours in the afternoon. Enough time for Maisie to show me her new gifts and eat a slice of shortbread before they said they had to get back. I said that was wonderful. I was so glad they came. I meant it even as it broke something in me a little more. In July, Patrick called to tell me they were doing a family trip in September. Florida. Just the 3 of them. Or so he said at first. 2 weeks later, Maisie mentioned on the phone that Grandma and Grandpa Fielding were coming too. Denna's parents. The whole Fielding side, she said, very excited about the pool at the resort. I was not invited. I was not in the rotation. I had become the grandmother Maisie mentioned on the phone, not the grandmother at the pool. I swallowed that. I said nothing. Told myself I understood. Families are complicated. They needed their own time. The stroke happened 6 weeks after they got back from Florida. Lying in that hospital bed while Bette read her paperback beside me, I stopped making excuses. I looked at the evidence plainly, the way you eventually have to when enough of it has accumulated. Patrick had chosen his career over his father's deathbed. He'd chosen a Las Vegas trip over my emergency. He'd been reducing me year by year, visit by visit, to someone he felt obligated toward rather than someone he loved, and I had been letting him. I had been grateful for the crumbs. The headache was still bad on day 3. That was there. A woman from my church, Ruth Ann, came by with soup she'd made from scratch and a card signed by what seemed like half the congregation. My family doctor, Dr. Osei Mensah, stopped in to check on my progress. The neurologist came through on rounds and told me my recovery was going better than expected. I had full feeling on my right side. My speech was clear. I would need physiotherapy, some lifestyle adjustments, medication, follow-up imaging, but I was, by the clinical measure of things, fortunate. I asked the floor nurse about the call log. She printed it for me without question. 31 calls. I folded it and put it in my bedside drawer next to Ruth Ann's card. Patrick called on day 4. I was sitting up, eating the soup Ruth Ann had brought, when my phone rang. His name on the screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. He said he'd just seen the messages. He said his phone had barely worked in Vegas, the hotel had terrible service. He'd been essentially offline for 3 days. His voice was urgent and sorry-sounding in a practiced way, the way he sounds in meetings when a deal goes sideways and he needs to manage someone's expectations. I said, they called 31 times. A pause. He said, it must have been a service issue. The messages just weren't coming through. I said, you posted on Instagram on Friday night and Saturday afternoon. The pause this time was longer. He said, that was Dina. She had a different carrier. Sometimes it works when I said, come on Saturday. He said, of course, Mom, absolutely. We'll be there first thing. He arrived at 11:30, without Maisie. She had a soccer tournament, he explained quickly. Very important one. She'd been looking forward to it for weeks. I nodded. He and Dina sat on the 2 chairs beside my bed in their weekend clothes, and for the first 20 minutes we talked about very little. the drive from Toronto, the traffic on the 403, the hospital parking situation. He asked about my symptoms in the way someone asks when they want to demonstrate concern without inviting a long answer. I gave him short ones. He checked his phone once. Danae looked at her watch. Then he said, "We've been thinking about you living alone. In Hamilton. At your age." There it was. He said he'd been worried. After this, clearly something needed to change. He'd done some research. There were some really excellent retirement communities in the area, he said. Some of them had independent living with medical support on site, which would give everyone peace of mind. He had some brochures in the car. He used the word proactive. He used the phrase quality of care. He did not once use the word home. I looked at him, at Denna, who was nodding with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this. I said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Oh, recently," he said. "Since this happened?" I said, "I'd like to see the brochures." He went to get them. The moment he left the room, something settled in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter and more solid, the recognition of a pattern finally completing itself. He was back in 5 minutes with a glossy folder. Sunrise Gardens, which was in Burlington, nice photos, bright dining rooms, smiling elderly people doing watercolor painting. He spread the materials on my bed tray with the briskness of a man closing a deal. I looked at the folder. Then I looked at the back page, which had a form, a preliminary inquiry form. Someone had already filled in part of it. My name, my age, 64, my address, a section about living situation, alone, following bereavement, already filled in, a section asking about observed cognitive changes and safety concerns at home, a checkbox, already checked. I looked up at my son. He was watching me with that careful, managed expression. I said, "When did you fill this in?" He said, "I just wanted to be prepared in case we needed to move quickly, for your safety." I said, "Before I had the stroke?" He said, "I'd been meaning to look into options for a while. This just made it more urgent." I looked at the form again. The date in the corner. Filled out 10 days ago. Before the stroke. Before the Vegas trip. The form had a section about assets, property ownership. What did I have in my name? The house. Gareth and I bought it in 1987, fully paid off. We're something now in the Hamilton market. Gareth's pension survivor's benefit. My own small pension from the school board. 30 years as a librarian. The life insurance payout we'd been careful about. Everything was listed in the form's margin, in Patrick's handwriting. It wasn't about my health. It was never about my health. It was never about my health. I told him I'd think about it. I asked him to leave it with me. He seemed satisfied. He and Denna stayed another 15 minutes, which made the visit exactly 50 minutes in total. He kissed my forehead at the door. Denna said they'd check in soon. I watched them walk down the hospital corridor. Dina's heels clicked on the linoleum. Patrick was already on his phone before they reached the elevator. After they left, Bette came in from the family lounge where she'd been waiting. She looked at my face, then at the folder on the bed tray. She said, "What is that?" I told her. Everything. The form, the dates, the asset questions, the checked boxes. She sat down. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He was calling people, you know. Before your stroke, he called me." I looked at her. "He called her in September," she said. Asked how I seemed, whether I'd had any falls, any memory issues, whether I'd said anything that seemed confused or out of character. He was worried, he told her, concerned about whether I was managing alone. She told him I was perfectly fine, sharper than half the people she knew, and he'd thanked her in a way that sounded disappointed. I hadn't known. I thought about who else he might have called. I thought about how a pattern of concerned phone calls to my friends and neighbors, combined with a conveniently filled-out inquiry form, combined with a medical event, could start to look like a case, not for my care, for my incompetence, for control over what I owned. The next morning, before Bette arrived, I called my lawyer. Her name is Joanne LaBelle. She has an office on King Street in Hamilton, and she handled Gareth's estate, and she is one of the most straightforward people I have ever known. I told her I was calling from the hospital. I told her I needed to update my will urgently. I told her I needed a trust established for my granddaughter, out of reach of her parents. I told her about the form, the phone calls, the calls to Bette, the asset questions in the margin. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not surprised. I've seen this pattern before. It has a name. It's called undue influence, and it's more common than people think." She said, "Are you of sound mind?" I said, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She said, "I'll have everything drafted by next week, and I'm going to recommend you request a formal cognitive assessment from your neurologist, on record, dated, before you sign anything, so there's no question." I said, "Do it." She came to the hospital 2 days before I was discharged. I signed the documents in front of 2 witnesses from the nursing staff. The neurologist had done the cognitive assessment the day before. Everything was properly dated, properly witnessed, legally sound. Joanne is thorough. She used to say Gareth taught her that he was an engineer, and engineers do not weave things loose. My granddaughter Maisie has a trust now, administered by Joanne until Maisie turns 19. Educational expenses in the event of my death. No parental access. No parental oversight. $120,000. Protected. Grace Community Church, where I've worshipped for 26 years, received a bequest. The Hamilton Public Library, where I worked for 30 years and where I fell in love with the smell of books as a child, received the Philip Gareth Ashworth Memorial Fund, named for my husband, designated for children's programming. A youth outreach program where Bette volunteers received a bequest as well, that cried when I told her. I told her to stop, or I'd start Patrick. I thought for a long time about Patrick, about the little boy who used to follow Gareth around the garage on Saturday mornings, handing him tools, asking how things worked. The boy who cried at Gareth's father's funeral when he was 8 years old and made me think, this child has a tender heart. I thought about where that boy went, and at what point the man who replaced him decided that his mother was a liability to be managed. I don't know the answer. Maybe he doesn't either. Patrick inherits nothing, except the knowledge that he had the opportunity and chose not to take it, not the inheritance, but the relationship. The time, the calls, the visits, the 50 minutes in a hospital room instead of 31 calls unanswered. I kept the house, I kept my pension, I kept my $80,000 for living. I told Joanne to make sure the document was clear that I was of sound mind and was making these decisions freely. She made sure. It's ironclad, she said. He can try to contest it. He will lose. Bette drove me home when I was discharged. She made tea while I walked through my house slowly, touching things. The photo of Gareth and me at Algonquin Park, 1989. Ridiculous matching windbreakers. Both of us laughing at something I can no longer remember. The school photo of Maisie from last year, gap-toothed, wearing a headband she picked herself. The brass lamp Gareth bought at a flea market in Elora that I always thought was ugly and now can't imagine parting with. I was still here. All of it was still mine. 3 weeks later, Patrick called. I was doing my physiotherapy exercises in the living room, the ones the physio had given me, slow and deliberate. I let the phone ring 4 times. Then I answered. He said, "Mom, I've been thinking about the estate planning conversation. I think we should sit down with your lawyer together. As a family, get everything on the table." I said, "The will has been updated." Silence. I said, "Joanne filed everything while I was still in hospital. Properly witnessed. Full cognitive assessment on record. There's nothing to contest." He said, "What?" I said, "Maisie has a trust. The house and remaining assets are designated to charity in my estate, with the exception of my living expenses. Your name is not in the document." He said, "Mom, you can't." I said, "I can." I did. And Patrick, before you say anything else, I want you to know that I know about the calls to Bette. I know about the September call. I know you filled out that form before I had the stroke. I know what was in the margins. Very long silence. He said, "That's not what it looked like." I said, "Then tell me what it looked like." He didn't. I said, "I have loved you your whole life. I defended you to your father when he was frustrated with you. I drove to Toronto for every milestone that mattered and sat in the back when you didn't save me a seat. I sent checks and made calls and left messages, and I told myself you were busy. You were building something. You'd come around. But you didn't come around, Patrick, and when the hospital called 31 times, you were at a blackjack table." Silence. I said, "I'm not angry anymore. I want you to understand that. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. There's a difference." I hung up. He called twice more that week. I answered the second time. The tone had shifted to negotiation, which I'd expected. He mentioned family therapy. He mentioned Maisie. He said I was hurting my granddaughter by doing this, which was the part of the conversation I dreaded most, because Maisie is the one genuinely innocent person in all of it. I told him Maisie had $120,000 for her education. I told him Maisie was not in any danger of being hurt by me. I told him that if he wanted to improve Maisie's relationship with her grandmother, the most effective thing he could do was not obstructed. Then I said goodbye. He didn't call again after that. I want to tell you about the Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the stroke, when someone knocked on my door. I was in the kitchen starting dinner. Lentil soup, which I'd been craving since before the stroke and hadn't gotten around to making. I opened the door and Bette was standing on my front step, and beside her, holding Bette's hand and wearing her winter coat with the hood up and a backpack with a unicorn on it, was Maisie. She looked up at me with those warm brown eyes. She said, "Hi, Grandma." "Bette said you make good shortbread." I sat down on the front step in October in Ontario, which is not a warm place to sit in October, and I pulled that little girl into my arms. She smelled like children's shampoo and cold air. She said, "I made you something when you were in the hospital." She produced it from her backpack. A drawing on construction paper, a woman with white hair and a big smile standing in front of a house. Red crayon letters, "Jet, Bette, Grandma, I miss you." She said, "Daddy said he gave it to you." I told him I wanted to make sure you got it. I looked at Bette over Maisie's head. Bette looked back at me. Neither of us said anything about that. We had soup and shortbread. Maisie told me about her soccer tournament, her best friend at school, whose name is Priya, a book she was reading about horses, her opinion on the correct way to fold napkins at restaurants, which was very detailed. I didn't ask how she'd come to be here or what Bette had said to make it possible. Some things don't need to be said. When it was time to leave, Maisie hugged me for a long time at the door. She said, "Can I come back?" I said, "Yes, anytime you want." She said, "Daddy might be weird about it." I said, "That's between you and your dad, sweetheart." I said, "That's between you and your dad, sweetheart. I will always be here." She thought about that. Then she nodded and went with Bette to the car. I stood in my doorway and watched the taillights until they turned the corner. That was 8 weeks ago. Maisie has been here 4 times since. Once Bette brought her. Once she came with a friend's mother who lives 2 streets over and knows our family. Once Dana dropped her off without coming inside. I don't know what that means, and I'm trying not to read too much into it. Last time, she came on her bicycle and let herself in with the spare key I gave her, the same key I gave Bette years ago, the same key that saved my life in October. It is January now. My recovery has gone well. I walk every morning, weather permitting, and when it doesn't permit, I walk in the mall like every self-respecting person in Hamilton over the age of 60. I'm back at my church on Sundays. Luzanne and I have started a book club with 4 other women from the congregation, which meets in my living room on the 2nd Thursday of every month. Dr. Osei Mensah says my blood work is good. The neurologist says my follow-up imaging looks exactly as she hoped. The house is mine. The kettle is mine. The maple trees outside my kitchen window are mine. Gareth's ugly flea market lamp is mine. The drawing on my refrigerator, "Jet, Bette, der Grandma, I miss you," is mine. I am 64 years old. I survived a stroke. I lost my son, though I've been losing him in small pieces for years, and the final piece was more of a confirmation than a surprise. I have my health, my home, my church, my Bette, my Ruth Ann, my book club, my twice-monthly visits from a 9-year-old girl who has opinions about napkin folding and who chooses to ride her bicycle 2 kilometers to her grandmother's house. I have booked a trip to Cape Breton for the spring. I've always wanted to see the Cabot Trail. Gareth and I kept saying we'd go. We kept running out of time. I'm going alone, which frightens me, and also doesn't. Not the way it would have a year ago. Someone said to me recently, Ruth Ann, I think over tea, that it's strange how a terrible thing can make space for something better. I didn't quite believe her at the time. I'm starting to. What I know now is what I should have known years ago, and what I want you to hear if any part of this sounds familiar to you. Love is not debt collection. It does not accumulate interest the longer you wait to pay it. The years I gave my son, the patience, the excuses, the shortbread I made, and the piano recitals I drove to, and the calls I made that went to voicemail, none of that obligated him to become a person who shows up, and none of my hoping made him into one. But Bette did, on her bad knees, on my cold kitchen floor, holding my head. Bette did. Family, I've learned, is not the people who share your last name. It's the people who know where the spare key is and use it. If this story found you at a time when you're still making excuses for someone who has stopped making an effort, I hope you'll be gentler with yourself than I was. You don't have to wait for a stroke to stop asking permission to matter. You already matter. You always did. I've been sitting with this story for a few months now, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, looking at every side, trying to understand the weight of it. And what I keep coming back to isn't the anger, which is mostly settled, or the grief, which comes and goes on its own schedule. What I keep coming back to is the question of what we teach people by the way we live. For years, I taught Patrick something without meaning to. I taught him that I would accommodate his absence, that I would rationalize it, excuse it, shrink my expectations to fit whatever he offered. Every time I said, that's okay, I understand, you're busy, when I didn't really understand, when it wasn't really okay, I was teaching him that I cost nothing, that showing up for me had no weight, no consequence, no meaning, he needed to take seriously. I did that, not out of weakness, or not only that, out of love, which is the most understandable reason in the world, and also, in this case, the most expensive one. What happened in October? The stroke, the 31 calls, the casino photo, the form with my assets listed in the margins. None of it came from nowhere. It was the end of a long road that I had paved, stone by stone, with every excuse I made and every hurt I swallowed. Cause produces effect. That's not a punishment, it's just how things work. Patrick became the man who didn't answer 31 calls because I raised him to believe that not answering had no cost. When I finally changed the terms, he didn't know how to respond. He still doesn't. That's also a consequence. This time. The hardest thing I've had to accept is that intelligence alone doesn't protect you from this. I am not an unintelligent woman. 30 years as a librarian. I read widely, I think carefully. I know how to evaluate information, and I still spent 4 years failing to correctly evaluate what was happening in my own family, because when it's someone you love, you don't want the evidence to add up to what it adds up to. Wisdom isn't just knowing things, it's being willing to see clearly even when clarity is costly. That part took me longer than it should have. What got me through? Bette on the kitchen floor, Ruth Ann with her soup, Joanne with her calm and thorough competence, Maisie on her bicycle with a drawing in her backpack. None of that arrived by accident either. I had spent years being a person who showed up for others. The church community, the library programming, the neighbors I checked on, the friend I drove to her appointments when her hip was bad. Those weren't investments. I wasn't keeping score. But the relationships they built were real, and when I needed them, they were there. You become a certain kind of person, and a certain kind of person finds you in return. The resilience part I'm still learning. I am 64 years old, and I am going to Cape Breton in the spring, alone, which I would not have considered possible a year ago. I am building something new out of what's left after the loss, which is, I think, the only honest definition of resilience I've ever come across. not the absence of damage. The decision to keep going anyway, with whatever you have, in whatever direction still feels true. Maisie came over last Saturday. She sat at my kitchen table and taught me a card game she'd learned at school, explaining the rules with the patient seriousness of a 9-year-old who suspects adults are not very bright. She was probably right. I let her win the first round and she knew immediately and told me not to do that. So I didn't. She beat me anyway. That's what I'm holding on to. The card game. The shortbread cooling on the rack. The key she knows where to find. The rest has a way of sorting itself out once you stop being afraid to let it.